So it appears that I have triggered a plethora of atheists online with my last video because I missed Alex's main point when it comes to suffering, and specifically when it comes to the suffering of the animals. So in today's video, I want to make sure to paraphrase Alex's main point so that I don't have everybody in my section commenting, you've missed the point, you didn't see it. And I will go into why it's still a bad argument against the likelihood of God's existence. So during the debate that Alex had with the 25 Christians, his first prompt was that suffering makes God's existence unlikely. Of course, he didn't specify in that first prompt what kind of suffering, but then he goes into talking about specific suffering. His main point was about animal suffering. Alex believes that naturalism better accounts for the abundant and proliferative suffering of animals on earth better than theism, because what God would allow this kind of suffering, this kind of proliferative, abundant suffering of animals if he could do something about it? And then he gives an example, for instance, of the zebra that, it's attacked by a lion and it takes, because it's too big of an animal, it doesn't die right away and it just suffers there. And because it's not even a human, it can't even rationalize why it's suffering because, it doesn't have the same mind that a human has. So Alex makes the point, why didn't God just turn all the animals into herbivores? If he could do something about that suffering, why he didn't do it? The answer is either he is not powerful or he doesn't exist. That's essentially the argument that Alex makes. He believes if a random stranger who was not from Earth was dropped into the earth and they observed the natural world the way it is and they saw this abundant suffering of animals, they would come to the conclusion that, this is just the way things are. This is just, natural selection doing its thing. The strongest animals live on and the weaker ones die. It's just the brute reality of things. Because if there was a God, why would he, given his creative power, given his ability, why would he allow this suffering to go on? So that's essentially the argument Alex makes. And he says, because of this, God's existence is unlikely. At one point he even says, if it is likely, then it's only likely that this God must be evil, because what kind of God would allow for such thing, for this, unredeemable suffering? That's the point that Alex makes. Hopefully I got that right. My objection to that argument is this. The very fact that we look at the world and we look at the suffering of this dying zebra, slow death, agonizing death, the fact that we look at that and we say, there's something deeply wrong with that. If there is a God, why would he allow that? That intuition itself, that observation and that intuition that springs and wells up in us, how unjust that is. That in itself is evidence of the fact that that is not the original way that the world was created. Because in a sense, when we look at this unjust scene of the animal, what exactly, if we're unhappy with this world, right? What kind of world are we really comparing this world to? So in a sense, our intuition, just the fact that we have this intuition tells us that this is not the original world that God made. There is some ideal that we're comparing to. And this is actually the point that C.S. Lewis makes in his book, Mere Christianity. You don't have to believe, some random girl who loves Jesus online and, who loves talking about these things. You don't have to believe me as an authority on this matter, okay? But C.S. Lewis was an atheist for a very long time before he became a Christian. And he wrote a lot of books on this matter. So if you don't want to believe me, let's at least assess the work of C.S. Lewis, who is a brilliant man. So I want to read to you this quote, and I suggest that you yourself spend a good amount of time on this brilliant quote that addresses this very point. My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such a violent reaction against it? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, In other words, that the whole reality was senseless, I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there was no light in the universe, and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should have never known it was dark. Dark would be without meaning. And I know there is a lot in this quote, and you have to really sit and think on exactly what Lou is saying. But this idea, that we go on and say, oh, this world is unjust, this world is cruel, what kind of God would allow this? What exactly are you comparing this world to? How is it that you get to assess that this is unjust suffering unless you're comparing it to an ideal, to a different world? And this is where, as Christians, we say this is not the world that God originally made. Yes, you should look at that animal suffering and look at that and see, whoa, there's something wrong with that. But we'll come back to that point. The second point that I want to make is this. Alex makes this point that, just from the minute that they come into the world, their whole life is defined primarily by suffering. And I disagree with that. And why do I disagree with that? For every zebra that is caught in the grip of a lion, they're slowly dying in this agonizing and terrible death. There is also a zebra that enjoys a full life on this beautiful planet that is fine-tuned for its existence, okay? And that zebra lives into old age and has a bunch of little babies, and ultimately dies. So for every agonizing death of a zebra that died prematurely, whatnot, there is a zebra that lives a full and healthy life. So you cannot say that their life is predominantly defined by suffering, because there is a good life that they live. So you can't just hone in on just that part of the zebra's experience and deny an abundance of good experiences of zebras. So to say that, their whole life is defined by suffering is an overstatement, because there's an abundance of a good life that zebras enjoy here on Earth, where they enjoy the sun, the water that God sustains of this fine-tuned universe, an ecosystem that allows life for the zebra, despite the suffering that some of the zebras have to go through, which is unjust and terrible. And we'll come back to that. But because there's still a lot of good, there is a high chance that there is a good God that sustains the life of a lot of zebras. So in this case, theism, to me, better explains the majority of the life that most of zebras enjoy here on Earth. Because who sustains the Earth? Who fine-tunes this whole universe with the right temperature of the sun, with the grass, with all of these things, who sustains this system? And the third point that I want to make, who created the zebra? Because atheists don't believe in a creator. So did zebras spontaneously crawl out of the goo and turn into a zoo of a zebra, right? Like, how did that happen? When you look at the natural world and its abundance and its diversity and all of this, if somebody got randomly dropped into the earth and they looked at different animals, zebras, lions, and all of this, they would believe that there's someone who made these. These things didn't just spontaneously appear. These things didn't just, come out of the thin air and just turn into these sophisticated, animals. Someone is behind the creation. There is a intelligent mind that lives outside the naturally created world. Theism would better account for the creation of the zebra than naturalism, because obviously naturalism does not believe in a creator. It believes somehow in natural selection, which is, it's like, how did natural selection come about? Because natural selection, if you believe in that, is just simply a mechanism. It's not a creative force that created the whole thing, right? So like somebody had to make the zebra come to life. And who did that? So theism better accounts for the creation of the zebra. And so the question at the end of the day is that if God is powerful enough to create all these zebras, to create this whole system, and yes, there is something wrong that happened, with the unjust suffering, because that is not the world that God originally created. And, Christianity insists that God's original creation was good, was perfect, was flawless. There was no death, there was no decay, there was no corruption. So when we look at the unjust death of that zebra in the grips of a lion, what we need to ask yourself, what went wrong? So the atheistic view of what went wrong is that God is on trial. he is the one to blame for all this unjust suffering because he could have done something about it. Well, God already had done everything about it in creating a perfect universe. That was not the world that God created. But we put God on trial and we give all the blame to God. Or if you're going to be a Christian like I am, we say, you know what? We take the responsibility for the suffering that the zebra is undergoing because this is not the original world that God created. And we assume responsibility because we parted, we disobeyed God. And now we were living out personally the consequences. And so are the animals because God put man above the animals. What I'm trying to say here is that as a human race, we could put God on trial and blame God for it had God not done anything to mitigate the suffering. But God did something. And that is specifically what Christianity affirms, is that God gave his one and only son to die for the sin of the world, to pay a price for sin, to redeem us, to redeem all the suffering, all the decay, to defeat death, and all of it combined. Because God sacrificed and gave, he is deeply involved in human suffering because he suffered. See, if God had not suffered, if Jesus had not incarnated to suffer and die, then we could put him on trial and say, you know what? You did not do anything. You are detached. You allowed this suffering and you've done nothing. The thing of it is that if God just changes everything back to a perfect world, would we have learned? Can we really learn as a human race unless there are consequences? I mean, think of a child. When you raise a child, you give the child everything that it wants. You never punish a child's behavior. What does that child grow up into? Disrespectful. They don't appreciate anything. They take everything for granted. So if God had just simply, not banished Adam and Eve and turned everything back to normal, would we have learned? See, the reason why God couldn't just magically turn everything back to normal, but even though he could, is because we had to learn what it means to walk away from God's way. There's a price that you pay from going and straying from God's order. It affects everything. It taints everything. But God still chose to give off himself, to put his son on trial instead of us, to save and redeem the world. And he is now allowing a window of time that we have so people can be saved. And here's the thing, Christ will come back and he will restore the order of everything. There will be no more death. There will be, Christ came, he resurrected. It's a historical event and he will redeem the whole earth. But this is the window of opportunity for people to be saved. So at the end of the day, whether you believe it or not, it doesn't change the fact that Christ will come back, that Christ will judge the world, that everybody will give an account, that this world does testify of God's existence. We want to create our own version of a God. Yes, God is loving and God is caring, but God is just. You cannot just think that, you just do something wrong and you just get away. Our disobedience costed a lot. It costed even the death of God's son. So that is the claim that Christianity makes. And, either you submit to that truth in humility, understanding that, I have a part in that animal's suffering. Or you say, you know what? God, you're the one who's at fault. I put you on trial. But at the end of the day, whatever you choose to do, you will stand before God, whether you believe it or not. So that is my objection to Alex's ideas. And here's the thing. At the end of the day, we're all going to find out what the truth is. And I know for sure that one day I will stand before Jesus and I'm going to be like, yes, my Lord, I've lived that life for you. But there will be plenty of atheists who say, you know what, I blame you, and they will be departed from the presence of God and they will spend an eternity in hell, true place, and apart from God. Take it as you want. The choice is yours. I lose nothing by embracing Jesus. Absolutely nothing. If you want to say there's nothing, sure, okay, there's nothing. But if there is something, there is a lot for you to rethink. That's all I'm going to say. Hopefully this time I did not miss the point. But if I did, so it be. All right, thank you guys for watching this video, and I'll see you guys in the next video.